was the hardest thing for like a young wrestler to grasp when you were actually growing up?
Hardest thing to grasp. These are tough questions. Well, I think the hardest things for people to grasp are the things that I grasp pretty quick, in the sense that it's not real. None of it's real, in the sense that the whole objective of pro wrestling is really to tell a story and to never ever hurt anybody, sort of thing. And when you start hurting each other or hurting somebody to get your, like chops as an example, they hurt. They completely go against the logic of wrestling. And they look like shit. The guys that chop all the time, and the fans, I think when I hear fans going woo and all that, I think it's so, I always learned that you don't take direction from the fans that way, where you let the fans dictate what you're going to do. And I think people like, anytime you're hurting yourself or hurting your opponent, you're going about everything the wrong way. You got the wrong logic.
Right. I was actually watching your interview you did down in North Carolina, your Q&A, and you were talking about how when the midget wrestlers would come to Calgary and stuff, you'd, as a little kid, get to wrestle with them and stuff like that. Like, at what point did you realize that you were definitely going to get into the business and, you needed to learn it? At what age do you think that was about?
I went through my whole life, I think, from being really small till, easily till I was 12, 13, 14, around 14, 15. I mean, all those years growing up to that age, I always thought that wrestling was something I would probably do. And I always thought I'd be pretty good at it. But when I got to be about 15, it changed, in the sense, I think more on account of who was working for my dad at the time. They weren't very interesting, and business wasn't so good. And they made me kind of lose interest in it, and it wasn't something I saw myself doing. And that shifted, and I went through my whole teens thinking that I'd never do wrestling. Like, it was like I had much bigger things on my horizon than that. But when I got to be about 20, you start doing enough construction jobs and things like that, and you're working all day digging a ditch or something, you realize that wrestling might be more fun than doing that. It might pay more, and you might need more girls and that kind of stuff. It just became more appealing to me.
I guess, in your opinion, what was the hardest thing for you to grasp as a wrestler when you first got into the business, like training and stuff like that?
Well, I don't know that I had much trouble grasping it. I understood what it was about, I think, pretty quick. I think most second generation wrestlers get it pretty fast, even if you don't follow it. Like, I'm sure Rock, after a couple of training sessions, just learning the basics and the bumps and all that stuff. Kurt Hennig, all these guys that were second generation wrestlers, they get it pretty fast. You learn pretty quick. You learn, I think the real art to wrestling is to learning how to protect yourself and learning how to protect your opponent.
What was the first thing that you were taught by your father?
I think I was always taught by my dad to try to make wrestling seem as realistic as possible, and to never, not to that you needed to follow up a good professional career always was backed up more solid by a good amateur career. And despite the fact that wrestling's sort of staged violence, or it's all contrived, and the storylines are worked going back for years, there's also a lot of little things that happen in the match that, especially years ago, like when I started, where you had to really know how to handle yourself, and you had to know how to protect yourself. And if you wrestled somebody that was trying to guzzle you or eat you up, you had to know how to stand up for yourself and stop that from happening, because sometimes that could be, all it took was one guy to wipe out. Maybe it took you 6 months to build up by somebody coming in and mopping the floor with you because he didn't like you. Things like that. So those things didn't happen so much, but you had to know when to stand up for yourself in the ring against some guys often that were much bigger than you. And there's a thin line there between how far you go with standing up for yourself. And even that there's a wide range of things that can happen if you go too far.
What were you taught if somebody was taking liberties with you in the ring? What were you told to do?
Just it was just an instinct. Like you just had to stand up for yourself and protect yourself. And usually, if you could wrestle a guy down pretty strongly, you know, you had to know how to take him down, and you had to know how to establish sometimes a much larger man that if any more of that stuff went on, you'd have to have an Olympic style match, you know. But I found a lot of big heavy wrestlers were pretty tough, but they didn't have the conditioning to get into they didn't want to. You could embarrass somebody yourself, you know, if they wanted to get foxy with you, as my dad would say.
Right.
You know, you could embarrass some guy that was much bigger than you by blowing him up or getting him tired. And just being confident enough to know, you know, when you have a good amateur background like that, or a good, say, shooting background, not that I had a shooting background, but I had a good amateur background, I was reasonably capable of defending myself at any given moment.
Was there ever any instances, since you were Stu's son, especially when you traveled outside the territory when you were young, where some of the promoters tried to test you? That didn't happen like that?
Or? Nah, I don't remember. Japan was about the only place I really got tested. I didn't get tested that was the same thing. They tested you on cardio kind of thing. In Japan, they like to cooperate with you right up until they had you pretty much with your tongue hanging down to your feet. And then they start taking liberties with you. And that was sort of an old trick.
Right.
That was what closest I ever came to having somebody sort of take liberties with me in the ring. Most of the time I was always treated pretty respectfully by most guys. And when I was younger, I think anything along those lines where I was being taken advantage of was probably just the process of paying my dues. You know, it was all, you know, in the end, it didn't matter much. You know, maybe sometimes you think it matters. You know, even a bad match. You have a bad match, you think it matters. You think everyone's going to remember. 2 weeks later, nobody remembers any of it, you know, that kind of thing. But in your mind, if you're a professional and you're an artist, you take pride in everything you do, and you think, you know, that one stinky match you had is going to be, everyone's going to remember it, and they'll never let you forget it. You know, it doesn't work like that. Same with when you win crowning moments in my dad's territory. I don't think you could find too many fans who will remember today.
One of the most important things about a wrestling match is pretty much to tell a story. And to do that, you have to have wrestling psychology. I guess, in your terms, how would you explain wrestling psychology, and how did you develop yours?
Well, I think the best thing I can say about wrestling psychology is that wrestling psychology follows the same thread that real sports has. If you want to see wrestling psychology, you watch Muhammad Ali's old boxing matches, and you watch Joe Louis or Jack Dempsey, or sometimes you watch these old. Anytime you saw somebody fight back and sort of come back after he's losing the first 3 or 4 rounds, and then comes back, fights back. I know guys like Sugar Ray Robinson and stuff like that. You know, you watch these old classic boxing matches, and wrestling really is just a takeoff on boxing psychology. Or not, I wouldn't say there's psychology to boxing, but the wrestling psychology patterns itself after, not just boxing, but real sports where you tell a story where you're fighting, you know, an uphill battle to get back to where you were and see if you can actually win the fight. And if you watch, like I said, if you watch some old classic matches, like you watch Foreman and Ali in Africa when they fought, and they did a documentary on that. But the psychology of that match, where Ali, got him to tire himself out and then, knocked him out. That's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful psychology. If you watch wrestling, I always try to take that in my matches. I always, right from the day I started, I always try to give people that same. I want them to believe in my matches the same way you believed in boxing matches. And, it applies to almost anything.
I guess, what is more important in the ring? Selling, the psychology of the match, the finish, or the actual selling and bumping around?
Well, they both go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And what selling should come down to is that as a baby face, it's really important to always fight back a little bit. You don't want to be a baby face that never fights back, because after a while, like if you're getting the crap kicked out of you in the ring and it's too much, or you're selling too much, when you start to get that feeling that the fans are starting to look back to the dressing room door to see who's going to come out and save you, that's when you realize you've sold too much. You're selling too much. You're dying out there. And it's up to a good villain to keep you alive all the time. Even though that's where people throw you in the ropes and call for a sunset flip. It's not a great, no, everyone knows you're not going to win, but it gives them a little hope that that's where that sense the term hope spot.
Right.
But, it works the other way around too, is that if you're a good baby face and you're selling like crazy and you're making the heel look pretty good, then it's his responsibility. And if he's a good pro, he'll take that into account and do a couple of things to make you look good, to keep you alive. And my attitude always is that the heel should do all he can, or can do all he wants in order to establish that he's, that he's the villain, and also that he's got the upper hand. And when you make your comeback, it's up to that heel, if he's a decent heel, to reward you in kind for how considerate you've been by making him look good. Now it's his turn it's a give and take thing. It's his turn to give back to you now and make you look like $1 million.
Watch thousands of exclusive shoot interviews right now on TitleMatchNetwork.com.